Sweetheart, have you seen my other mitten?
Nope.
Hi everybody! I thought today we would make some mittens. It's still pretty cold here up in Canada, and this is a great time of year to make yourself some mittens. We've already made a hat, we've already made a scarf, so it's probably time that we finish off that set with something cozy for our fingertips. Now, like a lot of the things that I make, I have decorated mine with a couple of snowflakes, because you know how I love to applique things onto stuff after I make it. So you can do that too, and I will definitely link some of the applique tutorials we've made down in the comment box below. But because it's sort of chilly outside, I'm not going to stand around out here all day, so let's go inside where it's warm to the craft table and make ourselves some mittens. To make our mittens, we are going to use a worsted weight acrylic or wool, depends on what you like, but I'm going to use an acrylic. Worsted weight, size 4 to make the actual mitten. If you're going to put on the pretty little applique, you can use a nice thin fingering sock weight yarn and use the same sized hook to get this nice lacy effect on the snowflake. And you can watch our snowflake tutorial for more information on that, and I'll put that link in the comment box below. So the mitten itself is a worsted weight size 4 yarn. We're going to use my favorite hook, which is a 4.25 millimeter, but you can also use a 4.5 or a 5 for this, because like our hat tutorial, this is based more on measurements of your individual hand and not so much on stitch count. So use a hook that's comfortable with the size of yarn you've chosen. You're going to need scissors, a little yarn needle. You may need a measuring tape. You don't have to have this, so if you haven't got one lying around, don't worry, but this does make it a little easier. And I highly recommend a pad of paper and a pen. Because you're making 2 mittens, you want to make sure that your second mitten is a near perfect mirror image of your first mitten, and you're going to want to write some notes. So that's what you need. Let's get started. We're going to start with the cuff. And there's a couple ways you can do this. You can measure using your measuring tape and pick a measurement that you like. Sort of look down the length of your wrist, take a measurement that you like, or if you haven't got a measuring tape, just start chaining. And I like to do things when I'm just sort of experimenting in sets of 10 first. So I'm going to make a slip knot. And I'm going to make sure that my slip knot can move around on my hook. And I'm going to chain 10 to begin with. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now, depending on the size of your yarn and the size of your hook and your individual stitch tension, your foundation row of 10 may be different than mine, which is why I always suggest starting with 10. Now that's a nice depth, and if I was beginning a set of mittens, I might just go ahead with that. But because I've already made a mitten, and I previously determined that I liked a stitch depth of 12, I'm going to have a foundation row of 13 chains. Why? Because if I want 12 stitches, I need one more little chain on the end as a turning chain. So I've already chained 10. I'm going to chain 3 more. 1, 2, 3, so that I have a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. And 13 is my turning chain. So my cuff rows will be a total of 12 stitches. I'm going to go ahead, make a note of that. Foundation chains, 13. So when I go ahead and I make my second mitten, it'll be exactly the same. And it's important because you're making 2. So after you've decided on your foundation chain row, and you've added 1 extra chain for your turning chain, we're going to single crochet. Always single crochet into the second chain from the hook. You don't use your turning chain, you go directly to the second chain. And a single crochet is you enter your hook through the stitch, or the chain in this case, wrap your yarn, and pull up a loop so that you have 2 loops on your hook. Wrap your yarn and pull it back through both. That's a single crochet in American terminology. You're going to single crochet across each of the rest of the chains in your foundation row, and this will be the first row of your cuff. When you get to the end of your first row, it's very important that you count. So there's first stitch 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There, 12. 12 stitches, that's the depth of my cuff. And it's the same as my other mitten. So from here on out, at the end of every row, you're going to chain 1, because you need to have a turning chain, turn your work, and in order to get this nice ribbed effect, we're going to work into the back loops only. This is your whole stitch. There's a front loop and a back loop. And the back loop is always the loop furthest away from you. And that is the loop that we are going to do all of our single crocheting into. So remember to skip the turning chain that you made and work into the first real stitch, and we're going to single crochet into the back loops only across this row and every other row in your cuff, and that's what's going to give us that nice ribbed look. Incidentally, doing this kind of a crochet stitch, so doing work into the back loops only, also gives your work a little bit of stretch because it's not quite as tight as work that's done through the whole stitch. So you're going to work back loops only, and when you get to the end of your next row, it's a good idea to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 stitches, and that's what I want. So from here on out, at the end of every row, remember to chain 1, turn your work, and you're going to single crochet into the back loops only in order to get a nice ribbed cuff. Alright, I've done a few rows now, just so I can sort of show you a bit better how that ribbed look ends up appearing in the flat work. So I've done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rows so far, and the other way you can do that is to lay it in front of you so that the first ridge is the first ridge appears on the second row, and you can count 2, 4, 6. You can count up that way. So I know I've done 6 rows. That's what the rib looked like, and in order to decide how long you need to make your cuff, you can take your measuring tape and measure around your wrist, not too tightly. You want to make sure that you've got room to maneuver. So for example, here I might do 6.5 inches, or if you want to do that in centimeters, 17 centimeters, might be a good circumference for me. And I'm going to continue single crocheting my back loop only ribbed cuff until I have a piece of fabric that measures 6.5 inches long without stretching. So you don't want to stretch it, because this is going to have a bit of give, and you want to be able to take your mitten and put it on and have a little bit of space around your wrist, because that's what makes it comfortable. So you can do that. If you don't have a measuring tape, you can just keep crocheting until you've got a piece that's longer and longer and longer, and just keep wrapping it around your wrist until you get to a position where it's comfortable and you know that's how many rows long you want it to be. Then you count your rows. Because I've already made a mitten, I know that my foundation chains are 13, my cuff depth, so the length of my cuff is only 12 stitches long, and the cuff width for me is 27 rows. That's optimal for me. And I made note of it last time, so I know that on my second mitten, I have to crochet 27 rows. So I'm going to go ahead and finish my cuff, and you guys can go ahead and finish yours. Okay, I have finished single crocheting my 27 rows, and as you can see, this fits around my wrist nice and neatly, and there's room for maneuverability, and it's not tight. So 27 rows is what I did my first mitten in. I made note of that, and now I've done my 27 rows for my second cuff. At the end of your last row, you're going to chain one, and you're going to bring both of those end rows together. And this is how we create a seam along our cuff. So the best thing to do is to ignore your turning chain, work either the whole stitch or the back loop only. I'm going to use the whole stitch this time. Put your hook through the first stitch and line it up with the first foundation chain in your foundation chain row, and you want to just pair those up together, and then you're going to slip stitch. And the slip stitching is just grabbing a hold of the yarn and pulling it back through everything. And you're going to go ahead and slip stitch all the way down your entire seam by picking up both pairs of stitches, one from the last row you just worked and one from your foundation row. And you're going to slip stitch all the way down, and that is going to create a nice, neat seam, and it won't be too visible. I mean, if you know what your work looks like, you'll know that there's a seam there. But the only other good thing about using the seam is that you can work both mittens to have the seam down the inside of your wrist. But if you're not picky, you don't even have to do a reverse of your mitten. You can do one to be exactly perfect so that your seam runs down the middle of the inside of your wrist every single time, or you can make two of these mittens exactly the same, and one seam will be on the inside, one seam will be on the outside. So if you're not picky about that, and I mean, look, you can barely tell that there's a seam there anyway. It looks so neat and tidy. You don't necessarily have to do a reversal of this mitten. You can just make two exactly the same, but we'll get to that. So after you have seamed your cuff shut, you're going to chain one, and this is what begins our mitten. So just to recap, you've written down your foundation chains, and that includes your turning chain. You've written down your cuff depth, which is going to be 12 stitches, say in my case. It could be different for you. And the width, which is actually the number of rows that your cuff ends up being. So you want to make sure you definitely have these three measurements or these three notations before you move on, because you don't want to forget when you go to make your second mitten. Now we're going to move up to the thumb row. So what we're going to do here is we're going to put our first mitten row across the top of our cuff. And you're going to do that by single crocheting into the same general stitch area that you did your last seam stitch in. And you're going to single crochet, you're going to make single crochet. So it's not really even, and you're going to make single crochets, one in the end of every single row, all the way around your cuff. And if you had, say, 27 rows in your cuff, like I did, you're going to have 27 stitches across the top of your cuff. And that is what we're going to do right now. So just stick your hook in anywhere you can get it to go, and just make sure you put one single crochet in the top of each row as you go. And it's a little funny because these are the ends of your rows, so be patient. Like I say, just make sure you get one stitch created at the end of each of those rows, so that the number of rows you have in your cuff equals the number of stitches that you'll wind up with all the way around your mitten. Once you've finished putting on that first row of your mitten, so you should have one single crochet in the end of each of your rows, and the number of stitches you have here should be equal to the number of rows you made. So once you finish that, That's your foundation mitten row. So that's the first row of the rest of your mitten, and that's going to count as row number 1 in terms of the mitten. So this is mitten row number 1, and now it's completed. Now we need to make our mitten a little bit bigger. So the easiest way to do this would be to squeeze your mitten shut and take a look at it. This is a good idea if you can't make if you have trouble with visuals, or you have trouble counting, or you have to put your mitten down a lot because you're chasing after the cat or the kids or something, then you can use safety pins or pieces of yarn here, or little stitch markers. But what you want to do is just split your mitten into 4 points, and I call this the compass points. So this would be the south compass point down here, the north compass point up here, and then west and east. And those are going to be the 4 points of your mitten, and you're going to come back to this several times. And I talk about the 4 compass points a lot in some of my tutorials, because this is, I find, some of the most even way to increase. And essentially what you're doing is you're going to work 4 increases into this row, and you just want to make them even, which is why I say use the 4 points. You can also take the number of your stitches, so for me this is 27, and divide that by 4, and then you know that you can put 2 in your south point, count 7, say, put 2 in your west point, count 7, put 2 in your north point, and so on and so forth. So however you want to evenly increase 4 times, that's how you want to do it. From here on out, we are not joining our rows, we are working in the round, so you're just going to work directly into that first single crochet you made to begin your mitten row, or your mitten. And for me, this is my first increase point. So I'm going to work 2 single crochets directly into this mitten point. Then I'm going to look around to my next point, and I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So on my 7th stitch, I'm going to work 2 more. And again, this doesn't have to be super perfect. You just want to increase evenly 4 times. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and here I am in my 7th stitch, which is also my west point. So I'm going to increase by single crocheting 2 times. Then I want to do it again at the north point, so I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Looks like 6 is the number for that one. So I'll count again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and here's my 6th, so I'm going to put 2 single crochets into that north compass point, or stitch number 6. And then I'm just going to decide, that looks like a good point there, that'll be my east point, so I'll count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So that'll be 7 stitches for me. And like I said, you could also have just indicated these stitches with stitch markers. However you want to do it, it's up to you. You just want to make sure that you increase evenly 4 times. And that's stitch number 4, 5, 6, and here's my last point. I'm going to work 2 single crochets into that last point, and then I'm going to single crochet back around to the beginning of this row. And I know where the beginning of this row is because I can determine that by one of several ways. First of all, here's my seam. And if the seam isn't obvious enough, here's my little tail from where I started my cuff. So I know that this is the very beginning of my row. And I can also see the little bump happening where I started my rows going continuously. This also doesn't have to be absolutely exacting. You just want to be right around, you know this is roughly where your start point is, and that's all that really matters. Now from here on out, I'm going to work several rows of straight single crochet without any more increases. And I'm going to try my mitten on several times because I want to single crochet around until I get to about here, which is where my thumb starts, so the base of my thumb. Now because I've already made a mitten, I know that I have to do 7 rows before I get up to my thumb. So your first mitten row, which is where you put all your single crochets across the top of the ridge of your cuff, that's row 1, and I have to do 7, including my increase row, until I get to the bottom of where my thumb starts. It might be different for you, but 7 is a good rule of thumb. Oh my goodness, I can't believe I said that. 7 is a good rule of thumb. But try 6 or 7, and just to make sure that it works for you, keep trying your mitten on. And once again, don't worry, mittens are very forgiving. If it's one row up or one row down, you really won't notice. You just want to make sure that you make note of it. So start single crocheting all the way around. Your new stitch count for your row will be whatever your foundation row was. So your however many rows you had in your cuff. For me that was 27. I had 27 stitches to start, and I've added 4 more. So my new row stitch count is 31. And I'm just going to keep single crocheting all the way around for 7 rows. I'm going to try my mitten on, and I'm going to make sure that it's in the right place. Alright, I've now finished my 7 rows, and that includes the first row that goes across the top of my cuff. I know that I only have to do 7 here because I've already made a mitten, and for me, 7 rows is what works out. But you can determine that for yourself by putting on your mitten, and then looking to make sure that it comes up to right about where that knuckle bone is on your thumb. That's roughly where you want to start your hole, and it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. I think 7 or 8 rows in here is probably enough for a standard sized hand. If you have really big hands and like they're much taller, you might want to add an extra couple of rows, and if you have little hands, then you probably don't need that many rows. But that's why I recommend you try your mitten on, or if you've got the hand you're making it for handy. I did it again. If you got the mitten hand handy, put it on and just double check it. But for me, this is 7 rows. Now I'm going to make my thumb hole row, and because I made note of that, so my thumb hole row is going to be at row number 8. I know that row number 8 of the mitten is going to be my thumb hole row. I've already made my left mitten, so I'm making my right mitten this time. If you don't care what side of your wrist your seam shows up on, you can do the exact same thing twice, and you'll just have a seam on the inside once, and you'll have a seam on the outside. But if you want to make it so that the seam's always on the inside, then you just have to follow these very simple instructions. Take your mitten, squeeze it so that your seam runs down right down the middle. Identify your 4 compass points. For your left mitten, identify this point. And you can put a clip on it, a pin, stitch marker, a piece of yarn, whatever. For your right mitten, you identify this point. And what you do is after you identify it, you come back 2. So for your left mitten, this is the point, this is the very edge, come back 2. 1, 2, and put your marker on this stitch. If you're doing the right mitten, like I am right now, identify this far point and go back 2. 1, 2. Now this is if you want really picky mittens. If that's too much, just identify that point and leave your little stitch in there. For me, because I like to count, I would say, okay, there's my point, I come back 2, I hang on to that, and I count. I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so I'm going to single crochet 5, and then I start my hole. Otherwise, I go all the way around here, and I either count to that stitch or I mark that stitch. And I can mark it with my hook and count all the way around, which I will do. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. So I'm going to go around 19 for my right thumb hole, and if I was doing my left, I would only do 5, but that's what I'm up to. So count 19 for me. This is what you do. You single crochet just like you would, nice and straight. So for example, if you were going to be doing your left, and I was making my left mitten, I would single crochet into the first 5 stitches, and then I would chain 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So 7 chains. That's for a standard sized thumb. If your thumbs are much bigger, you might want to do 1 or 2 extra, but this is standard and this will probably work for most hands. So you chain 7 and then you skip 5 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Into that next stitch, you're going to continue single crocheting. And then you can see you've created a hole. Now that's if you're making the left. And because I'm making the right, I'm going to zip around to stitch number 19. So 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19. And I'm going to do the exact same thing that I did for the left thumb. I'm going to chain 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Chain 7, skip 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And into the 6th stitch, I'm going to continue to single crochet. And as in both thumbs, you just continue, once you've created your thumb hole, you just continue single crocheting for the rest of the row. And then you come back around to the very beginning. So here's my right thumb hole. If you were doing your left, it would be over here. So you can see that. And now you're going to single crochet around every single stitch and chain. So your new count, so for example, my base count was 27 stitches. I increased 4 to 31, and now technically I have another 2. So I'm at 33. So basically your mitten stitch count now should be your base number of stitches. That would be this number of stitches across the top of each of your cuff rows, plus 6. So not that that's really important, but it's just if you want to make a perfectly mirror image mitten, it's good to have those numbers in your head. So that's why I like to count. You'll hear me talk about math a lot in my tutorials because math is so calming. If you count, you're less likely to make mistakes, and if you know what your stitch count is, you can increase and decrease a little easier, and you have a better idea of where you're at during the course of your crocheting project. So I'm going to single crochet all the way around. This is sort of the row, the mitten row that goes right above what I call the thumb hole row. And when you get to that space, so that thumb hole space, you're confronted with all the chains. So what I like to do is to just work the chains like I would if it was just a brand new chain foundation row. So you don't have to try and work them like they're the regular stitches, you just work them like they're chains because that's what they are. And you'll have 7 across the top here. And when you get to the end, you're going to have this one. So it's kind of funny. It's like you've got a half chain, a half stitch. All you want to do is count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I need to put one in to this last funny looking half chain, half stitch thing. There's 7. And then directly into the next stitch. Oops. There we go. And continue around to the beginning of my row. And there I am. Okay, so you've now created a thumb hole and you've put single crochets in around on top of that, securing that thumb hole so that it's nice and strong. Now we're going to decrease. So you're going to do the same thing again. You're going to make sure that your seam's in the middle. You're going to squeeze your mitten into 4. You're going to identify your 4 compass points. And at each of these points, you're going to decrease. And you're going to decrease by single crocheting 2 together. So if you have to, go ahead and mark your 4 points or do your counting. So for me, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So still 7. I'm going to stick with that. In your first point, so your beginning of your row, you're going to single crochet 2 together. And basically all you're going to do in this row is decrease 4 times. You want to do it fairly evenly. That's why I recommend the whole counting process. You're going to get around to your next point, or the side of your mitten, and you're going to decrease by single crocheting 2 together. You're going to get around back to your third point, or the sort of the middle of the back of your mitten. And if you're not counting and you don't have safety clips or anything, just keep squeezing it together and making a general note of where it is. This doesn't have to be exacting. It's just decreasing in a fairly even manner so that you have even decreasing around your mitten. You just don't want them all sort of squished together in one place. So that's my third decrease. And I'm going to zip around to my last point, which is going to be somewhere in the middle of my mitten hole. So this thing here, I'm going to pick the 2 middle stitches in my mitten hole, my thumb hole, and I'll do the other middle too. I'm going to single crochet 2 together, and then that's it. I have now decreased 4 times, and until I get to the end of my mitten, that is the last row of decrease that I have to worry about. So I'm going to finish off this row, which is a decrease row, come around back to the very beginning of it, lay it flat, give it a look, maybe even try it on. I keep telling you to try on your mittens. There you go. So far so good. And you see how decreasing right here brings it back in so that your mitten isn't going to be great huge sort of wide thing all the way up to the top. You do want your mitten to have just a little bit of body hugging capabilities, just so it's not so unwieldy you can't do anything with your hands when you're wearing them. So that's why I like that decrease row right after I've finished securing the thumb hole row. And that's it. Now you're just going to single crochet in every stitch all the way around until you've gotten to the top of your hand. So you want to be able to crochet right up to the top of your hand so that just the little tip of your tallest finger is sticking out the top. Now I have made note of that because I've already made a mitten. I know that the top of my fingers appears at row 28, so I'm going to single crochet now until I get to row 28, and row 28 is based on this row here being row number 1. So I've gone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I have 18 rows to go, and it's just going to be simple, straight single crochet all the way around. And if you're keeping track of your stitch count will now be your original stitch count. For me it was 27. We added 4, we added 2, and we took 4 away again. So now your stitch count will be your foundation row plus 2. For me, that's 29. So here I go. I'm going to continue single crocheting until my mitten is as tall as my tallest finger, and you guys should do that too. And I'll see you at the top. Okay, I've just finished making my last row. So I've done 28 from the top of my cuff up to the top of my finger. And I know from making my previous mitten that it's 28 rows that I need in straight single crochet. I put my mitten on and my little tip of my tip of my finger, I should say, is just sticking out the top there. And I know that that's as tall as I want to make it before I start to close it. And because I've already made one, I made note of it. So top of fingers happens at row 28. So I know that I need to do 28 rows because I did this on my last mitten. So then on my second mitten, I know enough to go to 28. So 28 rows. And now we're going to start to close it in. And I know it might look a little bulky and funny. Mittens tend to do that. This looks like bulky. It looks really wide. Don't worry, because as soon as we close in the top, it'll start to make a little more sense. So I'm going to this is a decrease row. It's a super decrease row, and there's really not a lot of thinking that goes into it. All you're going to do is single crochet 2 stitches together all the way around. And if I didn't make that clear enough before, single crocheting 2 stitches together is as simple as putting your hook in the next stitch and bringing up a loop as though you were going to single crochet, and doing the exact same thing again in the stitch next to that, so that you've got 3 loops on your hook And when you wrap and pull through all three, you have single crocheted 2 stitches together. You're going to go ahead and you're going to single crochet 2 stitches together all the way around this row. So for me, this is row 29. And for you guys, that could be row 30, could be row 26. Depends on how tall your hand is in relation to your cuff row. But whatever row that is, make sure you make note of it on your piece of paper. And then your first major decrease row, in fact, your only major decrease row, is the row right after that. So we're going to single crochet 2 stitches together all the way around. Alright, once you've single crocheted 2 together all the way around that row, it doesn't have to be exacting, so if you overlap 1 or 2, it's okay. All you're doing is basically closing in the top of your mitten. Now you're going to cut quite a length of string. So I'm going to say maybe 1.5 feet, so 38 centimeters or so, just to be on the safe side. You're going to fasten off. Let me get that out of the way. So after you've cut quite a length of string, you're going to fasten off, and all you do is wrap that around your hook and pull it back through your loop. Boom, and give it a little tug. Now you're going to take your yarn needle and you're going to thread up the end of that tail, and you're going to weave it. So you're going to weave it in one stitch and out the next, and in one stitch and out the next, and in one stitch and out the next. You're going to do that all the way around that top row of decrease that you just finished. And the point of doing this is so that you can cinch the top of your mitten closed. It's kind of like how we finished off the hat. It kind of makes it a nice, neat little finisher. So once you've gone all the way around, cinch it shut. And you're going to identify, so again, make it nice and tight. Make sure there's no hole showing. And you're going to go over top of it just to lock it down a few times. So this doesn't have to be, there's not a lot of thinking here either. So you're just going to whip stitch over top of it in a couple of different angles, just like we did with the hat. And it's a bit tricky because there's a lot of stitches there. You want to do this a handful of times, no less than 6, I'm going to say. Do it across a couple of different angles, because this is just going to lock that cinched bunch of stitches together. There we go. Give it a tug. Make sure there's no gaping holes anywhere. And then put your needle in the top of your mitten. Whoops. What you're going to do is you're going to push it through to the inside. There we go. Pull it out, and you're going to knot it on the inside of your mitten. And you just pick up a stitch, make a little knot. Maybe make it twice if you're worried that your mittens are going to have a lot of activity. And then just weave a little bit of the tail in. So it's on the inside of your mitten. This isn't really necessarily for being neat and tidy. It's just to lock the rest of that tail into place so that your knot doesn't undo down the road. And just going to backtrack on some of my stitches. And once I'm pretty sure that's cool, I'm going to snip my yarn. And I'm going to put my mitten on and make sure it fits. There you go. So you can see now that it closed in at the top. And if I put my other mitten on, you can see I've got pretty much a perfect exacting match. So that is the mitten part done. Now all we have to do is the thumb. Alright, in order to make the thumb, you're going to mimic a lot of what you've done in making the mitten. So we're going to start by making a slip knot. And once again, make sure that that's not too tight. It can move around on your hook. We're going to start at the inside corner of your mitten thumb hole. So for example, this is my right mitten. Here's the seam of my cuff. It's on the inside of my wrist. And I'm going to start on the inside. Now if this was the left mitten, say you're making the left one, and this is the inside. So you always want to do the start at the inside corner of your thumb hole. And you're going to put your hook in the first single crochet, the first real single crochet on the inside corner. And you're going to attach your yarn with a single crochet. So because you're working in kind of an awkward little circle here, be patient with yourself because this can be a little tricky because you've got this big heavy mitten hanging off your hook. So you're going to attach with a single crochet. There we go. And you're going to work a total of 14 single crochets around your mitten hole. Now I'm going to explain that in case you added extra chains when you were making your mitten hole. You should have, for example, 7 chains, 5 stitches, and 2 side pieces. If you made a bigger chain, let's say you made 8 or even 9 because you've got a really big thumb, then you're going to have that number plus the 2. So basically what you're doing is you're going to do all the stitches across the top of your little chain opening, all the stitches across the bottom of the stitches that you skipped for your opening, and you're going to use these 2 little pieces on either side of the mitten. So for me, that's a stitch count of 14. It might be different for you, and if this is your first mitten, just make note of how many stitches are in your thumb so that when you go to make your second mitten, you end up using the same number on that one. And this is the foundation row for your thumb. Okay, I'm just getting around to finishing the first row of my thumb. And I will now have a total of 14 stitches all the way around that thumb hole opening. And like the mitten, I'm not going to join my row with a slip stitch. I'm just going to work directly into that first single crochet that I made. And that first single crochet is the one I attached my yarn with. I'm going to single crochet directly into that. And I'm going to keep going around and around and around until, like your mitten, the top of your thumb crochet is equal to the top of your thumb tip. So for example, if you put your mitten on, you want to crochet until your thumb gets to be all the way up there, right at the top of your thumb, before you do any decreasing. So you're just going to single crochet straight all the way around until your thumb is as tall as your actual thumb itself. Now because I've already made a mitten, I've made note of that. My thumb tops out at row number 9. So I have to put 9 rows of single crochet, including the foundation thumb row, 9 rows of single crochet, and that'll be the top of my thumb. So make sure you make notes. You want your foundation chains, the cup depth, which is 12 stitches for me, could be different for you, your width, that's how many rows your cuff is. When your thumb row starts, when you're making your mitten, the top of your mitten, which is the tip of your fingers, what row that is, and now the last one, which is your thumb top. So the top of your thumb is the end of your mitten, and for me that's row 9. So all you're going to do is to continue single crocheting round and around and around. Don't join your rows, just make them continuous. And we will see you at the top of a thumb. Okay, I have now completed the top of my thumb. So there's 9 rows, and there's an easy way to catch that or count them. If you can always put a stitch marker in on your first stitch when you finished. But the other way to tell where your row count starts, because obviously when you start going round and round and round in circles, it might be difficult to determine where the mitten rows are and where the thumb rows are. If you hold your mitten so that the inside of your thumb is held right down here, you can see where the mitten rows go, and you can see where there is one stitch or two that don't quite fit. So here's one stitch that's going in this direction, and there's not one below it, and on either side of it, it doesn't quite look right. So you know that that's the stitch that you put into that one middle area when you started your thumb. So not one of the skipped stitches, not one of the chains, the one in between. And I can tell that that's where my thumb starts. So I count row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 rows. And because I've already done a mitten, I know that I need 9 rows in my thumb. And if I put it on, boop, 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 there's my thumb just barely sticking out the top, so I know that that is as tall as my mitten thumb needs to be. And just like the top of our mitten, we're going to decrease, we're going to do a super decrease row of 2 double crochet together. So single crochet 2 together, not double crochet. Single crochet 2 together all the way around. And this is a super decrease row, so it doesn't matter what your stitch count winds up being at the end of this. It will be roughly half of your stitch count that you had to start with. So for example, I had 14 stitches in each row of my thumb. So once I have finished this super decrease row, which is single crochet 2 together all the way around, I'll have roughly 7. And if I go over 1 or go under 1, it doesn't matter, because all I'm doing is just doing a single row of essentially cinching with stitches. So there I go. I have finished my last row, single crocheted 2 together all the way around. I'm going to cut a decent length of yarn because I'm going to do the same thing that I did for the top of the mitten. So I'm going to fasten off. I'm going to take my yarn needle, thread up that tail, and I'm going to weave it through the top of the stitches from that previous row. So weaving it in and out through the stitches of that last row. And then once I'm done, I'm going to cinch it shut, which won't be much because you didn't have a whole lot of stitches here to start with. So make sure it's nice and tight. And then do the same thing you did with the top of the mitten. So you're going to secure it into place by whip stitching over top of that cinched area, no less than 6 times. So at least 6 times. And change the angle that you go at, just so you make sure that you get as many of those stitches as possible. And just a couple more here, just to make sure. And keep opening it and make sure that there's no little spaces showing. And there's not. Good. Then you're going to do the same thing. You're going to stick your needle down into the thumb, and that might be a bit difficult to do, so you can turn your thumb inside out first. There we go. So stick your needle down through the top of your thumb and turn it inside out so that it comes out the bottom. So there's the top down in there, and I've turned it inside out just enough that I can knot it. Boop. I always like to knot things a couple times. I think it makes it a little more secure. And because this is the inside of the mitten, you don't have to weave this in for aesthetic purposes. You want to just weave in a bit of your end through some of those stitches just to secure that string, just so you know that your knot's not going to come out. And once you've done that, you can trim off the excess and push it back out and try on your mitten. There. Now you've got one little tail to weave in, and if you're so inclined, you can make this pretty little snowflake detail and sew that onto the back of your mitten too, or you can do any of the other pretty little details we've made. We've got stars and hearts and rainbows, but I like the snowflake because I think it matches with this time of year. So you can go ahead, sew on your little applique, weave in your little tails, and your mitten is done. And that is how we make a pair of customizable mittens with a pretty little decal. And you can do that with any of the little appliques that we've done up till now, and I've said I'm going to link them in the box down below. Thank you so much everyone for tuning in. Please remember to share our videos with your crafty friends, and I'd also like to send out a big thank you to everyone who has supported us at our Etsy store. We really appreciate it, and you're really helping us keep up the fun work at Jayda InStitches. So that's it for today. Please remember to tune in soon. We're going to have another quick tip, and we're going to have lots more tutorials, and we'll be coming back shortly with all of those. Thank you so much. Bye!